We're about to be on YouTube. I'll let you know.
I have to wait for the boss. That little square there.
Okay. And we are now on
You
YouTube.
good? Okay. Good morning, everyone. This is the press conference that I have before legislative meeting. I'm Phil Mendelson, Chairman of the Council, and tomorrow, March 2nd, the Council will have its fourth legislative meeting of Council period 24. We are beginning to get busier as we get into this new Council period. The legislative meeting will actually be preceded by a committee of the whole meeting, an additional committee of the whole, where we will be marking up a mayoral nomination to the Board of Zoning Adjustment, as well as agendizing several confirmations that the mayor proposed that were in the Committee on Housing and Executive Affairs. So all those matters will go through committee of the whole and then the legislative meeting. The legislative meeting also will have 7 items that are what we call congressional review emergencies. And the reason why I highlight this is because it points to the continuing burden on the council and the district government that when we pass legislation, it requires a 30-day congressional review, and that legislative review period can extend for months. And so we have 7 measures that in order to continue their effectiveness, we have to approve what we call congressional review emergencies. The permanent bills are pending in Congress. Some of you may remember that a month ago, I noted that we were not even able to deliver our bills to start the 30-day clock. That seems to have been worked out, although it still seems to be a bit of a cloak and dagger operation, needing congressional aides off-site to hand them our bills. In any event, there will be 7 congressional review emergencies on the agenda tomorrow. In addition, we will be approving for final reading a temporary bill dealing with the Homeland Security Fusion Center to ensure that it is treated, respected by other agencies in across the country as a law enforcement agency. And that's important for intelligence sharing and helping with the public safety in the district. This was critical in January when we approved this on an emergency basis. And the final vote on that is scheduled for tomorrow. There are about a half a dozen emergency bills on the agenda. I want to note a couple of them. One of them is an emergency bill to renew the public health emergency. What we are doing, and let me get my notes here, is that we're doing a number of things in this legislation. Now, we passed emergencies throughout last year and a temporary bill which essentially expires at the end of March. And so we are renewing everything tomorrow. The most important features are that the public health emergency is being extended to May 20th, 2021, which will coincide with some of the work that is happening on the executive side with public health officials, and where we will be in mid-May in terms of improving our situation in the public health emergency. In addition, the legislation will delay the deadline for the mayor to submit the fiscal year 2022 budget from March 31st to April 22nd. This is to enable the executive to include within the legislation, the budget, the proposed budget, federal payments to the district, which we are hopeful will be approved by Congress mid-March. So to ensure that those federal dollars are reflected in the budget, we are delaying the submission to April 22nd. That means the previously announced hearings by the different committees on the mayor's proposed budget are going to be rescheduled. We will still take our 70 days for approval of the budget, but obviously the clock will be delayed by 3 weeks. There are a number of other features in the bill, for example, addressing seasonal pricing. the seasonal pricing model, particularly for rental vehicles in the price gouging prohibition law, and continuing the waiver of community service as a requirement for graduation from high school in the district. It's a little hard to require as much community service when everything was shut down. And so we're continuing that waiver. Those are just a couple of the items that I wanted to note from that emergency bill. There was on the agenda, state education assessment waiver to waive the Parcc exam. I believe that emergency will be withdrawn. The state superintendent for education, Hasi, last week filed a waiver request with the Federal Department on Education. I can't say for sure that that waiver will be granted. There's optimism. And so at any event, the legislation would have called on the executive to do what they've already done, which is why I think that will be withdrawn. I am introducing a number of bills today. They'll be on the log tomorrow. One of them has to do with reenacting Title 49, which deals with the National Guard. I think there's a little more attention to that these days. And so we're going to try again to see if we can move that legislation. The bill that I'm introducing today that is getting the most attention probably is the cannabis. I don't have the exact title in front of me. It's a bill to regulate the sale and distribution of cannabis. And I am co-introducing this with most of the members of the council. I've had a stakeholder group that's been working with my office, and included have been representatives from Councilmember Allen as Chair of Judiciary and Councilmember McDuffie as Chair of Business and Economic Development, and some others working for the past year on this legislation. As you may know, there have been proposals over the past few years, and the proposals kind of ranged in different ways and what they were proposing. And so I thought it best to pull folks together and come up with a bill that would reflect best practices. I know that I guess I should say this, that there's a rider that Congress has put on appropriations bills the last maybe half dozen years that's prevented us from taking this step. That rider is still in place, but we are optimistic that that rider will be lifted this year. And so we have this legislation that's going into the hopper today. As I said, co-introduced by most of the members of the council. So we will be ready to move on that legislation, which will be sequentially referred to the Committee on Judiciary, the Committee on Business and Economic Development, and the Committee as a whole. We'll be ready to move expeditiously on that once the rider is lifted. The broad strokes of the bill that we are introducing are that there's a regulatory scheme to license the cultivation, production, and retail sale of cannabis in the district. It will be regulated through the Alcoholic Beverage Control Board, which will be renamed the Alcoholic Beverage and Cannabis Administration. There will be a robust social equity program to provide opportunities for entrepreneurship to individuals most impacted by the war on drugs. There's been quite a bit of discussion about these kinds of laws in other states and whether they recognize that there were communities that were especially hurt by the war on drugs and the criminality of smoking marijuana, or using marijuana, which is now legal in the district. And so this bill has been very sensitive to giving back to the communities most hurt. So there's a robust social equity program to provide opportunities for entrepreneurship, certain favorable treatments in the law. For example, setting aside at least half of the licenses for residents who have been previously convicted of cannabis-related offenses or have lived 5 of the last 10 years in areas with high rates of poverty, unemployment, and cannabis-related arrests. 30% of the tax revenues generated by this legislation would be deposited into a cannabis equity and Opportunity Fund to provide loans, grants, technical assistance to these applicants. You know, access to capital is always a challenge for small businesses, and especially in the area of cannabis, where the federal government still treats it as illegal. In addition, our legislation will establish a community reinvestment program for communities most impacted by the war on drugs. 50% of the tax revenues from the sale of cannabis would be deposited into a community reinvestment program fund, which would be used to provide grants to organizations addressing issues such as economic development, homeless prevention, support for returning citizens, and civil legal aid in areas with high poverty, high unemployment, and gun violence. And then in addition, the legislation would provide for the automatic expungement of DC code cannabis-related arrests and convictions, and opportunities for resentencing of cannabis-related convictions. So in these ways, we're trying to not only finally address the sale of cannabis, which has been legal, but has been prohibited from being regulated since Congress imposed that rider, but to take the revenue that we will be getting and besides regulating the sale, taking that revenue and plowing almost all of it back into the communities that have been hit hardest by the war on drugs. I know that the mayor introduced legislation last week. It was a bit of a surprise to us. And the bill that we are introducing does differ from what the mayor introduced. More sensitive on the taxation issue so that there's less incentive for a black market. More robust with the issues of expungement and resentencing. More robust with issues such as reinvestment or assisting social equity applicants. And also more robust, the bill that we're introducing with regard to protecting the medical cannabis market. And our legislation explicitly addresses protecting those who individuals who are on public benefit programs and protecting individuals in employment situations. So in those ways, the bill that we're introducing has really looked at these issues and is, I think, more sensitive and robust with regard to them. We'll just see if there's anything else I want to say. So that bill's being introduced today, along with a number of other bills that I'm introducing, and will be on the log tomorrow. The next meeting after tomorrow will be on March 16th. It's a committee of the whole meeting, and with that, let me see if there are questions. Perry Stein.
Yes, yeah, thank you so much for having this. I know there's a number of education bills on the docket or that have been introduced, and you mentioned at least one of them, but I'm specifically curious of your stances on Robert White's bill, Councilmember Robert White's bill, and also the bills coming from Councilmember George and Shed that would make OSSI independent. My question for you is, if you could break down what your stances are on both Councilmember White's bill and Shay and George's bill, and what you plan to introduce, when those will be on the agenda.
Well, Mr. White had proposed a rules change to set up a special committee. That is not on the agenda for tomorrow. Of the other bills that were introduced, and you referred to, I believe, two that deal with OSSI, the Office of State Superintendent for Education, and its independence. We will probably have a hearing on that after the budget. May not be until the fall. I'm not really saying how soon because I haven't looked at a calendar, so I just can't say. But I've been concerned for a number of years with regard to just how independent OSSI is, and so I think that's worth taking a look at least having.
Concerned about how independent it is.
Yes. And so there'll be a hearing on those proposals. That's not to say where they will end up, but I think it's a very important issue to look at that. You know, when the council adopted the Education Act in 2007, there was a lot of talk about accountability and the structure that was set up, created under the mayor, the deputy mayor for education, the chancellor, and the Office of State Superintendent for Education, or OSSE. In most states, in fact, in all states, I have to emphasize, in all states, the Office of the State Superintendent for Education is independent of the school districts. And that's not really the case here. And there's a value to having a state education office that is separate from. And that's what you have in every state except here. So I do think that issue is worth looking at.
And what about, the council member rights book? Do you think that such a committee would be beneficial or do we not need it? So
My answer is no.
we do not need it.
Correct.
Is that why? Is there a reason why it's not on the agenda this week?
I think for the moment, I'll just note that when he filed it last week, he said if it is retained, then he would like it on the agenda.
Say that one more time, I'm sorry.
Well, this gets a bit technical, but when he circulated the notice, he said if it is retained, he would like it on the agenda.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Perry. Mr. Rice.
What are your thoughts on what happened to Capitol on January 6th? In general.
I think there was an insurrection. I think the insurrection was incited by the former president. And I think it was a real threat to democracy. I think that it was very reminiscent of the very kinds of insurrections that the founding fathers were concerned about when they drafted the Constitution. You know, I think Shays' Rebellion was one of them. And somehow I have in my mind the Whiskey Rebellion, Shays' Rebellion. I think there was one other. And I think that there are many who denied the gravity of what was happening.
And you're going to be testifying on the bill.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I also think there was an irony that unfortunate that it existed, but also pleasurable in the sense that the district, you know, the founding fathers were afraid of the local government being a threat to the federal government, which is why they wanted to have a federal district. And here it was the local government that came to the aid of and assisted the federal government. You know, we were the ones who sent our police up there to help to bail out the Capitol. And rather than being a threat, we were a savior. The exact opposite of what the founding fathers were afraid of. Sort of what I alluded to when I mentioned the reintroducing the National Guard bill, that you know, one of the realizations on January 6th was that unlike any state, we don't control the National Guard. And so when we wanted the National Guard to come and help, the Pentagon was in the way.
And how would statehood solve that?
Because if we had statehood, then we would have the same control over our National Guard as all the other states, as the 50 states. And that's all we're asking for, is to be treated the same as citizens in the 50 states, because we are, last I checked, citizens of the United States.
How would that help or not situation?
Well, the mayor would have been able to call it the National Guard instead of pleading with the Pentagon to please, Mr. Secretary, would you allow the National Guard to come and help your own capital? But the other side of it, which I've already said, is that what we saw on January 6th is that rather than being a threat, we were a help to the federal government.
You talked about social equity, resentencing, and and is that one of the bills that will undergo analysis by the new council?
On racial equity, all bills will. Once that office is off the ground, which it's moving very quickly to get off the ground, all bills will be going through. There are a couple of exceptions, but I think the budget is an exception.
And how will that work? Will it just issue a report or might it hold hearings?
No, it will not be holding hearings. Correct. It'll be not the same, but somewhat like the process for fiscal impact statements. So there's not a hearing, but there's an analysis.
So there is or is not opportunity for citizens to talk to the office, submit testimony? How does that work?
There would not be an opportunity to submit testimony, but I don't think the office is inaccessible. So if somebody wanted to talk to them, they could. These issues are very complex. When I say these issues, I mean, when you look at what the equity impact is of an issue, it can be very complex. We gave the example in the legislative report accompanying the REACH Act, which, by the way, the REACH Act is one of the Congressional Review Emergencies I mentioned earlier. We talked about syntaxes, which oftentimes are, on the one hand, meant to help I'm going to say low-income neighborhoods, for instance. I'm thinking of like the tobacco tax. We want fewer people to smoke, but on the other hand, these taxes are regressive, and so therefore they have a greater impact, adverse impact on low-income communities. So which is the equitable answer? To tax them more or to have them smoke less? I'm just saying that's to make the point that these issues are complex. And what this office is expected to do is, on the one hand, work with the committees so the committees are more sensitive to equity impacts, and that would be reflected in the legislation, but also to put forward that analysis, which can be, yeah, it's good this way and harmful at the same time, or good this way, but harmful at the same time. And that would generate more thought and discussion. And what is the value of reducing smoking greater than the harm of increasing a regressive tax? So that kind of analysis.
More.
Hold on a second. What were the other questions?
The other question is, last week there was a hearing on the issue on the secretary, which PCR came up. What are your plans to appoint archive advocacy panel?
Yes, I'm overdoing that. I appreciate you reminding me. I better have this done before the next press conference, Mr. Rice.
And lastly, you said, what did you say the new budget deadline is for the
I believe it is April 22nd. Well, my commitment was to get the comprehensive plan through the council before the budget. So it gives us a little bit more latitude there, but we're working on getting that bill out this month. Correct. There's a lot, it's a 1,500 page bill. And we continue to get comments. The record's closed, but that doesn't mean that we don't get comments. And I'm probably meeting with groups several times a week. And some folks are adamant, pass it as is. Some folks are adamant, send this back to the mayor for her to do over. I kind of love the way it's either the most wonderful or the worst thing. Somehow there's no middle for a lot of folks. Correct. That's the needle. That's the needle to be threaded. I do want to note, council members have been receiving a lot of calls and emails from citizens in the district who are very upset over the vaccination rollout. And so I did want to speak to that for a minute. Over the weekend, council members, there were a number of council members who were not only talking with each other, but also reaching out to other folks. I believe there were some conversations with representatives from Microsoft. I know there were some conversations with senior level officials in the administration. I spoke with the city administrator yesterday. Quite a bit of discussion about how to prevent any further collapse in the website when folks are going to register. My understanding from my conversations is that the executive is looking at changing the way folks are registering so that we don't have tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people at the same minute of the same hour trying to register for vaccines. I mean, it's a real challenge that, as we all know, there just are way too few doses given the number of people who want vaccines. But still, it is very unfair to folks that they go on the website as they're supposed to do and the website crashes. Members are very concerned about that. My conversation with the city administrator yesterday, they're as concerned. And so there are a lot of conversations taking place to see if in the next few days this can't get fixed so that by the end of the week, I guess that's the next opportunity that we won't see the system crashing again. I do want to emphasize the council is not the agency that runs the website. We don't do this. We didn't set it up, but members are very concerned and looking for solutions.
And given that,
Yes,
both times,
I've received both doses. Yes. Unfortunately, there was a time when I was like 20 or 28, but unfortunately, I'm a little older than that. So we'll leave it at that. If you can't figure out
one of the big problems is the age of the system that is being asked to do with. Is that one of the problems?
that's not my understanding. The age of the system is the problem. Although I have to say that when I think of computer systems in the government, I usually assume they're older than they should be. My understanding is the problem has to do with the process that was set up with the software. So it's not an age issue, it's the process in the software. Do we have any other? I'm unaware of any other questions from.
I got one more question. This is Mary Stein.
Hi, Perry.
Hey, I know I've been, CC'd on some these. I know the council's been receiving a lot of emails from parents who are frustrated about the pace of reopening. I'm curious if you see if the council, what your response to these parents are. I mean, I know it's becoming clear school leaders are telling their families, whether that be on the charter sector or TCPS, that they will not get they will not be guaranteed slot in-person offering for the fourth term, and some charters have dropped out on the fall. And I'm curious what you see as the council's role in this, and if I know we've talked about this before, but what your stance is on the piece of reopening right now.
Well, there seem to be a number of parents who are very apprehensive about the safety of reopening, but then also an increasing number of parents who have lost their patience with regard to the fact that schools have not reopened and that there are adverse consequences either from distance learning or from a mental health standpoint, or even just ordinary needs of kids to socialize. So strong feelings in both ways. As you know, Perry, the committee of the whole has now had 3 hearings related to school opening or learning loss. And we have oversight hearings coming up on March 9th and 10th, where we will continue to press on this issue. As I indicated earlier, we're extending the public health emergency to mid-May because we think that where the public health officials will be is clear on what the city can do in terms of reopening generally, but also in terms of the schools. When I say we, I'm talking about my office, the community as a whole, my staff. We are pressing hard to get the city, or rather school officials, to be clearer with regard to a plan. What is their plan? Is it just sort of vague statements, or do they actually know when they will be in person or how much in person? We're not looking to force kids against their will to come into school, but still to see how quickly we can reopen so that kids have the opportunity or ability to come into the classroom where they will learn better, as well as other beneficial byproducts of being in person in schools. So I'm not really giving you a clear answer as to what, but clearly we want to see more of a plan, and we're anxious that we move as quickly as is safe to be reopening.
Thank you.
Perry, you may be the last question unless there's anybody else. All right, thank you all very much. So the meeting will, our meeting started at noon now. Committee of the whole at noon, followed by the